I'm sure that there will be many who have questions relating to some of these issues that Dr. Cunningham has raised. But right now we are going to hear from Dr. Tom Nichols. And he is coming to us from the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And we certainly appreciate that he has come a distance to tell us about what he observes on this our today topic. And he was a fellow at Harvard in the International Security Program and Project on Managing the Atom at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. And in Washington, he was personal staff for Defense and Security Affairs of the U.S. Senate to the late Senator John Heinz of Pennsylvania, and was a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is currently a senior associate of the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs and a fellow of the International History Institute at Boston University. And so we certainly will be interested to hear from him, and so we welcome him right now if he's available. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And first, let me say how honored I am to be here and how it's always wonderful. I've come back to the University of Toronto many times. Bob was not my dissertation advisor, but I wish he had been. But I thank you very much for the invitation and for having me here. So I'm glad to be able to speak with you today. Obviously, I don't represent the U.S. government or any agency or educational institution I'm affiliated with, and once you hear my views on reforming nuclear weapons, you'll know just how much I don't represent the views of the United States government or anybody else. I took the ideas that I'm going to lay out for you today are developed in more detail in this book, and thank you, Jack, for your kind words about the book. But I took as the starting point that the scientists and the engineers have done their job. They've done what was asked of them. They've created these systems. And the fact of the matter is these systems do not speak for themselves. They don't have any inherent meaning. A hammer does not care what nail it hits or whether it's used at all. They're tools. And I think for too long, we've treated nuclear weapons, particularly because of the straitjacket of the Cold War, we've treated nuclear weapons as somehow they are sentient creatures that have intentions all their own. They don't. They're merely man-made items. And therefore, it's the job not of the scientists and the engineers to figure out what to do with them, but the job of the social scientists, the political advisors, the strategists, the people who work on these issues every day, and our elected representatives. They're the ones that are supposed to figure out what to do with these things. And with that in mind, what I've tried to do in talking in thinking through this book and in the things I'm going to talk to you about for the next few moments is I'm trying to imagine a new future, a different future, without the constraints of the Cold War. If I were standing here 25 years ago, as I did 25 years ago, I would be telling you something very different. I began my academic life as an analyst of Soviet affairs. I spent a lot of time studying the adversary, and I had a very different view of nuclear weapons during the Cold War. I wished that the Cold War would end so that we could take a new approach to nuclear weapons, and I think it's part of the honest test of a Cold Warrior to see if after that conflict ends, any of us actually change our strategies. I have, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. But I, again, feel very strongly that this is a problem that is very much in the domain of the political thinkers, the social scientists, the strategists, who I believe for too long have abdicated their responsibilities to the technological community in hopes that somehow there could be an answer that could be derived with numerical or scientific specificity. The fact of the matter is nuclear weapons are a political problem. They are not an engineering problem. We solve the engineering problem. We're pretty sure we know how they work. The question now is what to do with them. I would also argue that this is not an issue that divides political camps in the way it used to. Back in the old days, it was an easier argument to have. Liberals were abolitionists, and conservatives were the nuclear buildup guys, and the Dr. Strangeloves were the right-wingers, and the people carrying olive branches and doves were the left-wingers. I think that was always an artificial distinction, and I think particularly after the Cold War, especially after the Cold War, it's a very artificial distinction. The new division, I find, having a career that's bridged from the Cold War in my youth to the post-Cold War period in my advanced youth, whatever this is, that the new division is between people who are trying to think forward and traditionalists, between nuclear reformers and nuclear institutionalists, or the nuclear establishment, the people who resist change for the sake of change. So I'm going to put forward some ideas here. But first, let me point out that part of the problem, and of course I'm primarily speaking here of American nuclear strategy, is that we are drenched in Cold War inertia. Now, there are institutional and bureaucratic reasons for this. When you create a bureaucracy, no bureaucracy ever puts out a vision statement that says we've achieved our mission and it's time to disband our offices. That's political science 101. But there is also an argument that the nuclear traditionalists make that whatever it was we did for 50 years, as Jack's presentation made clear, it seemed to work. There was no war, or at least not a nuclear war. There was no major conventional war in Europe. There were proxy wars or skirmishes. A lot of people died. But we didn't have a war that threatened to extinguish life in the Northern Hemisphere and bring to an end human history. Unfortunately, that's the inertia we've stayed with. And I like to say that every time the Americans redo their strategy, what they get is a mini-me of their old strategy. They just get a smaller version of whatever it was we were doing the last time. The New START Treaty, for example, which President Obama had to expend a huge amount of effort to pass when really it should have been almost an afterthought in the Senate on a voice vote that turned into a very controversial issue in the United States. That's still based on an agreed Russian and American ability. The negotiators got to the point where they basically agreed that the number of weapons in the treaty, 1,550 warheads each, was enough to destroy at least 150 urban centers on each side. And that somehow that constituted deterrence. To me, that constitutes pretty much the end of the world, but it's better than the treaty that came before it, which was 2,200 weapons, which was better than the treaty before that, which was 6,000 weapons. I would point out, particularly to and I suppose this is where I get my dander up as an American, when the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is mentioned and people remind the superpowers that they have an obligation to build down their weapons. The United States has agreed to a treaty that will limit American forces to 1,550 nuclear warheads. In 1967, the United States had 32,000 nuclear warheads. I would argue there's been a good faith build down, and we're trying to get lower. I completely agree with Jack's point about global zero. I would love to live in that world if it could be made into a stable world. I think that the goal of global zero, admirable though it is getting in the way of a much more attainable and much more stabilizing goal, which is global low, or global very low, which I think is attainable. The problem is, if you're going to have global low and get down into the low hundreds of nuclear weapons, or even smaller, then you have to have a strategy that goes with them. You simply can't keep taking the old strategy and saying, well, times have changed, so we're just going to make it smaller. We'll do exactly what we were doing, but we'll just keep kind of downsizing it. We still have an obsession, for example, with the triad in the United States. We still have to have 3 means of delivering nuclear weapons. Why? Because 3, obviously, is a magic number. Because there are land and sea, there are oceans, and there is air, and there is water, and so that's just how it works. I also think that NATO nuclear arms, and again, 25 years ago, if I were standing here, I would be arguing for the crucial role of NATO nuclear arms in extended deterrence. But those weapons no longer have a mission. They just don't. There is no credible strategy that makes any sense, and we keep trying to figure one out. That's part of the problem, is that we keep trying to design strategies around the weapons we have instead of designing weapons to service new strategies. We always start from whatever it is that exists, and we work around that rather than starting from what it is we want to do and then create the systems behind that. And this is actually going to become a very important question for the United States, because those weapons in Europe are dying of old age, to put it bluntly. They are going to have to be replaced, and replacing them is going to be fantastically expensive. My argument is to take them out entirely. But let me put forward at this point 3 steps for reform. First, I believe the United States could do this very easily with by changing its declaratory policy. And boy, this is again a good place to say that I don't represent the government or the Carnegie Council or Canada or Boston University or my neighborhood watch or anybody else. First, I think it's long past time to simply declare a strategy of minimum deterrence. That is, the notion that any use of nuclear weapons is probably enough to deter any of the major powers. We talk about exchanging strikes in the dozens or hundreds. This is fantasy, in my opinion. Think about how much, just a couple of days ago, there was an American news article that pointed out that some of the traceable cesium from the Fukushima plant had finally reached the west coast of the United States, and this was a big news story. Oh, some of this radiation. And in the same breath, you say, yes, people think, oh, this is a terrible thing. And yet, in the same breath, you will hear us blithely talk about, well, if the North Koreans use a nuclear weapon, then we'll use nuclear weapons against them. As though dropping 5 or 6 or 7 nuclear weapons in Asia will be regarded with equanimity by everybody else in the world, or dropping nuclear weapons in the Middle East. I'm convinced that that is something that we will never do. So instead of trying to design these war-fighting strategies around the nuclear arsenal that we have, I think we can pare our arsenal down to an arsenal built around minimum deterrence. And this is a new idea that's old. I work at the Naval War College, where Admiral Ardley Burke is a revered figure. And Arleigh Burke argued in the 1950s that a couple of hundred nuclear weapons would be more than enough to deter the Soviet Union, because a couple of hundred nuclear weapons would be more than enough to destroy the entire Soviet Union. He lost that argument to the Air Force, and later in some of these wonderful historical documents that have since been declassified, Burke bitterly complained that he'd lost to the Air Force, who in his opinion were as bad as the communists and used the same methods. I also believe that it is long past time for the United States to join the other great powers in declaring a policy of no first use. Again, were I standing here during the Cold War, I would have been the first, and Bob, who has known me quite a long time, would know I would have been the first to come out of my seat to argue that a no first use policy was dangerous madness. NATO was successfully defended during the 1960s and 70s, not by a no first use policy, but by a damn well guaranteed first use policy that we made very clear to the Soviet Union. We were unambiguous with our Soviet adversary. We said, look, if you invade Europe, we will have no choice. You'll win. You'll win. We admit it. That we have no way to stop you. You'll roll to the Rhine. You'll be washing your boots in the English Channel. And something terrible will happen before then, which is that you will overrun our nuclear weapons and we'll have to use them first. Those days are over. There is no equivalent threat to NATO, no matter what Vladimir Putin says, although I do have my concerns about Vladimir Putin's emotional stability, all kidding aside. I have genuine worries about that. But there are implications. If these 3 declaratory steps were taken, what kind of implications do those have for the future? Some of them we've already taken. I genuinely believe that the Americans, the British, the French, the Chinese, I can't speak for the Russians on this because their nuclear doctrine is scary. But I think we're already at the point where we mostly have a minimum deterrence force. Moving away from multiple warhead missiles to single warhead missiles, which are no good in a first strike. No sane person would use a salvo of single warhead missiles in a first strike. Their only purpose can be retaliation. I don't really know, and this is where my Air Force colleagues, I have bruises all over me from my arguing with my Air Force colleagues. I don't know that there's really a role for manned nuclear bombers anymore. I'm not sure that they really have any purpose, but I believe in, I actually have been arguing against what is an emerging conventional wisdom in the United States. I believe in the necessity of land-based ICBMs. Why? Location, 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 just as in real estate. What makes them an effective deterrent is that no enemy can ever consider attacking them without attacking the sovereign territory of the United States. I don't want to have a seagoing missile force far away that could end up either detached from us or lost or in conflict with enemy ships. I'm all for taking a very small number of nuclear weapons, burying them in the middle of the United States and saying the only thing these things are meant to do is to retaliate for the use of nuclear weapons against the United States of America. I don't know that extended deterrence really has a future. I think in particular, I'll talk about NATO in a moment, but the other thing we can do is de-alert these weapons. Many of these weapons have been taken off their alerts. Nonetheless, Hans Christensen at the Federation of American Scientists and other arms control experts estimate that many of these weapons, dozens to hundreds, are on a 15-minute ability to go. This isn't 1958. The commies are not going to sneak over the pole and surprise us. It's not going to happen. We don't need to be on a 15-minute alert with strategic intercontinental weapons. And finally, I would remove our final tactical nuclear weapons from Europe. And yes, this would give the Russians a huge tactical nuclear superiority in Europe. So what? NATO is, and I'm not, even though I am a fiscal conservative, I'm not doing this to save money because I would actually pour considerable money into the conventional reinvigoration of NATO, in part to make it clear to the Russians that no menacing of the Atlantic Alliance can ever succeed on a conventional level. I think part of what's encouraging Putin is not just our reticence to lead NATO, but also our unwillingness to invest in our own defense in NATO. But I don't believe in limited tactical nuclear war scenarios in Europe. I don't believe that the Russians think that they're going to somehow, turn the map red. I mean, this is stuff out of a James Bond movie. And I would actually remove those tactical weapons from Europe very publicly and very unilaterally and hang that right around Moscow's neck and to point out, to simply say, we're the ones that are denuclearizing Europe. You're the people that are insisting on relying on the nuclear crutch. I have come to believe that American unilateralism is also a form of American leadership. I don't think that we need to negotiate every single one of these in lockstep with the Russians. That, to me, is a Cold War hangover. I actually think on this, the Bush administration, the Bush 43 administration, was actually more progressive on arms control than the Obama administration after it, because the Bush administration didn't believe in arms control. George W. Bush said, just do what my father did. Get rid of the weapons unilaterally that you don't think you need, and you don't really need treaties and lawyers and all that. And nonetheless, he was prevailed upon to sign what came to be known as the Moscow Treaty. But I like that basic instinct that says, build down to what you think keeps you secure. You don't need to constantly ask the Russians for permission as though you're negotiating with the Arms Control Association, because the Russians will never have the same view of this that you do. And when Hillary Clinton was first confirmed, she said, I'm a big proponent of nuclear arms control in cooperation with the Russians. And my heart sank, because it said, if we're going to wait to do this bilaterally with the Russians, then we're really not going to get very far. And the fact is, we haven't gotten very far. I think that, let me just add one more comment here. What would I do about the North Koreans, the Iranians, and others? I believe we need to stop making nuclear threats that we're not going to carry out in those areas. And again, I think we need to reinvest in our conventional weapons and make it clear that small countries that acquire or use nuclear weapons will find themselves directly in a state of war with the United States, but not in a nuclear confrontation, because I think that, again, we're making threats with nuclear weapons that we're really not prepared to carry out. Finally, I don't think any of I've laid out this very ambitious roadmap. I don't think any of it's going to happen anytime soon because of the nature of the political situation in the United States. I think the president squandered a lot of political capital early on in his first 2 years. The almost failure of the New START treaty suggests that anything bolder isn't going to go very far, but I do think that there is an opportunity as the next administration comes in to relook at this entire issue and to develop a new American strategy for the future. Thanks.